Hello and welcome to my video where I will show you how to make an embroidered clay ornament. We'll be using image transfer techniques as well as learning how to do blanket stitch. For this project you will need some polymer clay. In this case I'm using Fimo Soft in a white colour. And you'll also need some kind of roller. I'm using an acrylic roller, but you could also use a pasta roller. I'm using a narrow drinking straw to add holes and a cutting blade to cut the clay. You'll also need a surface to work on, as well as a surface to bake your clay on. I'm using a ceramic tile. You'll also need a laser printed image. There are ways of doing an image transfer with inkjet, however laser printed is a lot easier. To find an image to use, search for copyright free Creative Commons images online, and you should be able to find something suitable that's free to use. I will provide a link to the image I've used under this video. If you want to use an image that's not symmetrical, make sure you reverse the image before you print it, because whatever you print will be transferred in reverse, so you'll get the mirror image of whatever you print. You'll need at least a couple of grits of wet and dry sandpaper, preferably medium grit and fine grit. You'll also need some scissors, an oven, some yarn or thick thread, and a needle that you can thread the yarn into. As an optional but recommended extra, you can add some sealer or some varnish to your ornament at the end. I'm using a Rust-Oleum clear coat spray, which is suitable for a range of materials. Another optional extra I'm going to use is a metallic silver permanent marker, and this is just to add a little bit of shine to the skull design. If you want to add a bit of colour or sparkle to the skull design, then feel free to add any kind of embellishment you like, including acrylic paints, permanent markers and glitter. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing you need to do is cut out your laser printed image. I just take my scissors and cut around it, leaving a narrow white border. I then condition my clay, and I do this by working it with my hands to warm it up and make it pliable. Once it's nice and pliable, you can roll it out into an even thickness. Using a pasta roller is helpful to get an even thickness, but if you don't have one, then you can use playing cards or lollipop sticks to make sure you get that even height all across your clay. Roll out the clay until it's about 1 centimetre bigger than your image on each side. Next, we're going to transfer the image to the clay. So first, you need to get a little bit of water on your fingertip and apply it all over the clay. You want a very, very thin layer of water all over the clay. You don't want to add too much. You then need to place your image face down onto the clay. Make sure you centre it and be careful, because once it's placed down onto the clay, you can't then move it because otherwise the ink will smudge. Then you need to add a little bit more water on top of the paper. So wet your finger and then dab your finger all over the paper. You don't want to slide the paper, so use a dabbing motion. My paper went slightly wrinkled. I think I put too much water underneath the image. If this happens, just try and get as much of the paper in contact with the clay as possible. One important thing with image transfer is to not leave it too long. You want to leave it to just dry, but you don't want to, for instance, leave it overnight, because if it dries out too much, the image will be faded or the paper will be too stuck to your clay. I then waited for the paper to be just about dry, and then I tried to lift the corner of the image up off the clay to see if the image transfer had been successful. Once I saw that the image had transferred, I lifted the whole piece of paper off the clay. You can then cut around this skull shape. So I'm just taking my little cutter blade and cutting around the skull shape like so, leaving a small border. this border between the outside line of the image and the outside edge of the clay must be big enough to allow for a little bit of sanding, as well as to comfortably fit the holes you're going to add, which you're going to use for the embroidery. In hindsight, it would have been easier to use a craft blade to cut this out and use something protective under the clay to stop the work surface getting scratched. However, the cutting blade worked fine. I then used my finger to just smooth out the edge after I'd cut it, because I like a smooth curved edge. But you don't have to do this, you can finish the edge however you like. I ended up with a border just shy of 10mm wide. I then used my drinking straw to add the holes all around the border of the clay. Try and make sure that you put one of the holes in the centre at the top of your ornament, as this will help with the embroidery later. I'm going to space out the holes all the way around the border so that they're about 10mm apart. I'm not going to measure it, I'm just going to do this by eye. One thing you should check as well is that whatever you're using to make the holes is large enough to allow both your needle and your yarn through. If you're only using a thin thread and a small needle, then you can choose to make the holes much smaller if you prefer, and also position them closer together. I, however, am using quite chunky yarn and a large needle, so this drinking straw hole is perfect. Once the holes have been added, then it's time to put the clay in the oven. I just followed the manufacturer's instructions on my clay, and because it's Fimo clay that I'm using, I put my clay in the oven for 30 minutes at 130 degrees centigrade. So you just follow the instructions on your clay and put it in for the maximum time that it recommends. Then take the clay out of the oven and let it cool completely. I then use my wet and dry sandpaper to give the edge of my clay a bit of a sand, just to get rid of any scratches and make it nice and smooth. I'm using the sandpaper dry, so I've got good ventilation. However, I did this just to get it on camera, and I would definitely recommend that you use the sandpaper wet instead, so that the clay dust doesn't go everywhere. After all, you don't want to breathe that in. Remember that the yarn embroidery will end up covering most of the clay edge anyway, so you don't have to make it perfect. Once you've finished sanding, make sure to clean all of the dust off the clay and make sure it's dry before going on to the next step, which is where we add some embellishment. So at this point, if you want to add any permanent marker details or glitter or acrylic paint, then now is the time to do it. I just added a little bit of shine by colouring in some of the shapes with my Sharpie silver pen. The next step is to add a clear layer over the top of the clay. This is to protect the image transfer and also any embellishments you've added. I like to use Plasticoat's matte clear spray, as shown here, as I think it gives a nice finish. But you can add your choice of finish, which could be something like Fimo varnish or even resin. Just something to protect your work. Once the sealer or varnish is all dry, then it's time to move on to the embroidery. I think the needle I used was a tapestry needle, it might have been a yarn needle, but whatever needle you can find that has an eye big enough for your yarn to go through is perfect. Estimate how much yarn you're going to need and cut that amount off your ball of yarn. Always overestimate because you don't want to run out. If, when you were adding the holes to the border of this clay, you added one right in the centre at the top, then that is the hole that you'll start at and finish at. I didn't make a hole right in the centre, so I'm going to start at the hole that's just right of centre. So to begin, I feed the needle and thread from the back to the front through that first hole. Make sure that the tail of yarn you leave at the back is plenty long enough to make a hanger loop for your ornament. Then you're going to take your needle from the back to the front again through the same hole. Then feed your needle from right to left through the loop of yarn that you create, and tighten that to form a knot. And now we're ready to start stitching, and I'm going to do this in a clockwise direction. So I take my needle from back to front through the hole next to the hole where I started. Pull the yarn until you're left with just a small loop of yarn sticking up. Then feed your needle from right to left through this loop and pull tight. This type of stitch is called blanket stitch, which is particularly good for polymer clay because it covers up the edge and gives a decorative border. And you simply carry on like this all the way around the ornament. So you go from back to front through the next hole, and then from right to left through the loop. And this is what your stitch should look like. So I'm just going to add this blanket stitch all the way around the clay ornament until I get back to where I started. When I've completed my last stitch, I then do one single knot to secure the yarn, and then one more for good luck. Then I remove the needle from the yarn and stretch the two yarn tails up above the ornament. After deciding how long I want the hanging loop to be, I make another knot and then cut off the excess yarn. And there you go, you've finished your ornament. I hope you've had fun making it, and thank you very much for watching.